Hey guys, what's up? Me again, and it's time for another Wombo combo review from the house of SMSL that shines a light on that DO200 DAC and HO200 preamplifier and headphone amplifier. Now, I have already covered plenty, if not really all, SMSL stacks before, like S6 line, S8, S9 line, but it's time for something else, not only in terms of looks, but especially in terms of sound performance, so let's have a closer look at them. Design-wise, honestly, besides their high-end VMV series like D1 SC and D2, everything else looked a little out of place, with elongated bodies, with angled cases, with misaligned screens, buttons, switches, and so on. And for the first time, I'm seeing order and just simplicity in their design. There's a volume wheel exactly in the middle, smoothed out and CNC machined rectangular boxes, even number of rubber feet, and just an easier to digest design altogether. These are unibody cases, of course, with two plates attached on their front and back, and weighing around 1.2 kilos apiece. These are small and light enough to be used in crowded office desks or stereo setups. As for controls, HO200 reminds me quite a lot about old school amplifiers, thanks to those mechanical switches that will be changing its working mode, its gain position. There's a 4-pin XLR 4.4mm balanced output and a regular 1/4-inch headphone jack, and on its back you'll find a pair of RCA and XLR inputs and the same number of analog outputs, since it can also work as a preamplifier. The DO200 DAC looks a little slicker and more futuristic, with a volume knob in the middle and an LCD screen to its right. On its back you'll find the golden digital quintet as USB, optical, coaxial, I2S and AAC, a Bluetooth antenna socket, and two analog outputs coming in RCA and XLR flavors. As for tech inside them, SMSL went with the latest generation ESS Sabre Silicon with the ES9068 that also has an MQA decoder on board. Two pieces, meaning that you'll be getting a lower channel crosstalk and of course slightly higher signal-to-noise ratio, which means better performance. ES9068 is a current output chip, meaning that a current to voltage conversion stage needs to be built around those chips, and for that they used warmer and slightly more natural sounding OPA 6 and 12 op amps, which sincerely are better suited for this particular silicon. The best X-Mode receiver is also on board, and a brand new Bluetooth chipset that supports some of the nicest codecs as LDAC and aptX adaptive. As for HO200, SMSL ditched THX AAA modules in favor of their own precise linear feedback circuit modules that are pumping 6 watts in 16 ohms and half that number in 32 ohms, which seems plenty enough even for hard-to-drive planars. Alright guys, this is pretty much it, so let's hit some eardrums. Besides a fresh new look, SMSL did also made changes, quite big ones when it comes to sound performance. So instead of linear, dead neutral, very technical sounding, stack like S6, S8, S9, this time around they wanted to plant a little bit more life in my music. So there is definitely a little more bass, a little more mid-range, and smoothed out, not as clinical sounding treble delivery. They sounded really nice even with linear sounding headphones like HD 800S, like Abyss, like Hi-Fi Susvara. Yes, even Hi-Fi Susvara worked pretty nicely with this one. There's a higher gain of 23 dB compared to their past amplifiers that had 17 dB like SP200, like SH9. So I could barely touch that 2 o'clock position, something that I couldn't do with those amplifiers because those were running out of breath pretty fast. So it works good to almost great with Hi-Fi Susvara, with Abyss, which comes as a huge surprise considering their price point. While I wouldn't buy something like this for endgame headphones like Abyss, like Susvara, they worked good to almost great with both of them, which was a surprise considering their size, their weight, their price point, and those power ratings. HO200 wasn't really driving both headphones to their maximum potential, but that's understandable considering their very low sensitivity, but still dynamics weren't really going into the abyss. Bass notes were still quite playful, so I've got plenty of oomph in the bass, plenty of punch in the bass. Driver control was pretty nice. I never felt that, you know, something was loose sounding or something like that, so that's a great thing in my book. The DO200, on the other hand, was not only clearer and more detailed sounding compared to SU8S and SU9N, but also airier, you know, more spacious, bigger sounding on all axes compared to those units. And instead of a boring but ultra clean sound, I believe that the DO200 was more musical sounding. It was adding more soul into my music, even more compared to pricier converters like topping D90 SE, but less compared to SMSL high-end series like VNV D1 SE and D2. More important than ever is that this stack was making music livelier, you know, more engaging, something that I couldn't say about past SMSL combos. In terms of noise floor, I'm getting a strong feeling that I've listened to this exact amplifier over and over and over again. That's because those PLFC modules are killing the noise by using negative feedback, you know, within the circuit, exactly how tapping made with those NFCA modules, exactly how THX AAA modules are working. Slightly different, but that's a different story. So SMSL measured a noise floor of 1 microvolt, and of course that's instrument grade, that's world-class performance, pretty much in line with the benchmark HPA4, with the topping A90, with the SMSL SP400, with the Singster SA1. So of course on the low gain, on the mid gain, on the 4.4mm balanced output, regardless of the volume level, it could be even maximum volume, I couldn't spot really nothing with all my IEMs, regardless of their sensitivity, so it was simply dead silent. So this is a very IEM friendly amplifier. There was a little bit of noise on the high gain, but of course that's understandable considering how much power it pumps on high gain. There is only a small nitpick, and that's when you lower the volume to the lowest position, regardless of the gain, you can hear your music playing in the background. You know, not a biggie for me, but it needs to be mentioned. Moving on to how clean and how detailed they can sound. As I was saying, SMSL used some very clever techniques in the analog domain that lowered that noise floor, and of course that had a positive effect on resolution, on detail retrieval. And even without any kind of burn-in, it was clear to me that both units were pushing, you know, higher quantities of information towards me, even more compared to any other stack that SMSL made so far. And the biggest surprise for me was not the HO200 that uses those PLFC modules, and of course by default sounds very clean. The biggest surprise was the DO200 that was clearer sounding and even more spacious, you know, bigger sounding compared to all those S6, S8 and S9 series DACs, and of course that was quite unusual but interesting nonetheless. A performance like this will cost you probably an arm and a leg a few years ago, but I'm happy to have such performance nowadays. You know, that wouldn't cost you as much. And I believe it's the right time for Audio Precision to update their audio analyzers, because with units like this, these are pretty much challenging, you know, the best measuring equipment out there. So in the end, I believe that both units have good linearity, so I never found them clinical sounding or boring sounding. They were detailed, transparent, but also enjoyable and, you know, just easy to listen to. When it comes to raw numbers, we're looking at the same 6 watts per channel in 16 ohms, so that's exactly the same as their SP200, SH8S, SH9. But since there's a higher gain factor of 23 dB versus 16 versus 17 dB on those amplifiers, it feels over 9,000 compared to those amplifiers, because what was 12 o'clock right now is 10 o'clock, so of course you have a lot more headroom remaining on top. So with all my headphones, I didn't need more than mid-gain, including HD800S, LCD5, LCD4, RZH4 Boss, Keneton Rogner. I've got a pleasant surprise with Susvara and Abyss, because there was slightly more life in it compared to SH8S, compared to SH9. And while it has several protection circuits in place, like overload, overvoltage, EDC protection circuits, I could never overdrive this amplifier even with heavier loads, which again was a surprise. Moving on to transients, I believe that its higher gain factor improved the transient response, especially with modern tunes played by coplanar headphones. So I believe that Odyssey LCD4 and Abyss 1266 were quite snappy, quite punchy, quite hard slamming in the bass, never limiting those dynamics. They were quite fun sounding, engaging, coming pretty close to mid-level class amplifiers like Singster SM1, like Barson Soloist 3X. It was not going berserk as class amplifiers doing by default, but it was coming very, very close to them. ESS Saber DACs and SMSL amplifiers, so pretty much all of them are regarded as quite fast sounding. So you'll be getting shorter decays compared to, say, hybrid amplifiers or class amplifiers, tube amplifiers, and of course shorter decays compared to R2R or FPGA DACs. So you should expect for a really fast, snappy transient response and with a decent slam in the bass. This one has a close to zero output impedance, so it's not limiting the damping factor. It's a wide bandwidth design that never limits the power output, and you can be sure that nothing would be stopping this one from delivering a nicer kick in the nuts. Moving on to Soundstage, SMSL crafted the DO200 DAC as a dual mono, fully differential, fully balanced DAC that uses two DAC chips in current mode operation. So without boring you down with the technical stuff, I'll just mention that I believe that SMSL achieved maximum or close to maximum potential when it comes to scale, soundstage depth with this particular silicon. So usually ESS Saber converters aren't really regarded as pushing the boundaries in terms of scale, as pushing the sounds outside your head in a headphone setup. But with clever engineering, I believe that everything is possible, and DA200 is pretty much a testament to that. So while it will not sound, super big, wide, airy, pushing the notes on the individual shelves, it will not sound holographic like R2R DACs are doing that by default. I do believe that it tries to mimic that sound as much as possible, considering the limitations as its size, price, and all those internal components. When it comes to frequency response, SMSL always liked a nicer kick in the bass, and especially their higher-end series like VMV D1SC, like D2 had a mild accent in the bass, especially when it comes to quantity. Those were quite bold sounding, quite thick sounding in the bass. And I do believe that DO200 follows pretty much the same route. On the other hand, HO200 with those PLFC modules provides a higher quality type of bass instead of quantity, so they worked as yin and yang together, providing quality and quantity. That's why I've listened to plenty of electronica tracks with Abyss on my head. It was a very enjoyable experience. Moving on to mid-range, SMSL counterbalanced that sharp sounding ESS Saber silicon with the help of bipolar operational amplifiers from Texas Instruments. So OPA 6 and 12 are doing exactly that, and of course there's a higher number of discrete components as transistors, as diodes compared to their entry-level devices, and all those things combined without pouring you down is leading to a warmer, smoother sounding mid-range. There's a higher tonal density. So if you love your vocal performance, fuller sounding, violins, guitars, all that, fuller bodied, then you'll definitely get that with this combo compared to, say, ultra-linear sounding THX AAA or NFC amplifiers. SMSL simply traded some linearity with warmth, with tonal density, and everything that is happening in this region felt a little more alive, a little fuller bodied, a little heavier sounding. Very much in line with their, or approaching a little to their VMV D1SC and VMV D2 series that also had that bold mid-range. Treble is probably the only region that felt identical on both devices, so both units were singing the same song, both were quite detailed, clean sounding, sharp sounding, but not overly sharp sounding. So I was not getting that raw and unpolished feel of the S8 series because some naturalness, some refinement made its way into this setup. So if I can listen to HD800S and Abyss with rock and metal tunes on this setup all day long, then I can listen to anything really, and that's all you need to know about its treble performance. In the end, I couldn't fault any of these. There is no noise whatsoever with IEMs, there is no distortion at higher volumes with planar magnetic headphones, there is a decent amount of air always traveling around my tunes. Sure enough, they would not put goosebumps all over my body as True Automatic Audio Primavera is doing so easily, but you know, considering their size, price point and power ratings, I don't believe you can get anything better, especially if you want to drive several pairs of headphones. Their smaller stocks were quite decent sounding, but of course this one shoots for a much higher spot in my rankings, hence scoring a silver award for a great overall performance. Okay guys, this is pretty much it. My full in-depth review can be found below. Please check it out. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and as usual, listen to more tunes, be positive, and see you soon. Cheers!